Welcome to Continuous Identity Sessions, where we connect the brightest minds in identity with the strategies and real-world approaches that make IAM work better. I'm your host and continuously curious identity nerd, Dustin Avol, still here, and each session we sit down with the people building and managing identity at enterprise scale, the ones who have figured out how to eliminate bottlenecks, reduce manual work, and implement automation to actually improve security without slowing down the business. People who are doing cool and interesting stuff. Today, we're focusing on dynamic security orchestration, basically making your existing IAM infrastructure respond to what's happening right now, not just what happened in the last provisioning cycle. If you've ever watched a security event unfold and thought, well, I need to do something, I need to kill that person's privileged access immediately, or why is this ticket sitting in a queue when we could just provision the access? Then you know the gap between how fast threats move and how fast our identity processes maybe historically have responded. Today, I am so happy and excited to be joined by Lori Robinson, VP of Product at SailPoint, who's been thinking deeply about how to make enterprise IAM work at machine speed without ripping out what you've already built. For those interactive audience members, please remember use the Q&A panel. We'll try to tackle as many questions as we can. And of course, we'll follow up everyone that we don't have time for today. So let's get to it. Lori, I'm done speaking just to myself there, or just to the audience. Thank you for joining us. How are you? Where are you? What's new?
Hi, Dustin. I am great. I am in Utah, wishing for snow, but we're not there yet. We're having a warm, late fall, so that's where I am. And yeah, I'm good.
Great.
Excited to be here.
Yeah, we're excited to have you. Before we dive in deeper, maybe you can help me improve on my introduction there and tell me a little bit more about what you cover at SailPoint and maybe a quick sense of what's happening lately there.
Yeah, as you said, I'm in product management, and I have the pleasure of running the ISC, the Identity Security Cloud team, and also what we call privileged security posture management, which really aligns nicely with what we're going to be talking about today, looking at privileged entitlements and essentially how we can continuously evaluate risk inside of our customers' environment. So
yeah, it's a great segue. I've got to jump on it. As you may have heard, this show is about this emerging movement, this continuous identity. How is that continuing to shape SailPoint's business roadmap, customer interest, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, I think things are changing in our customer environments rapidly, especially with the introduction of machines and agents. I guess really the introduction of agents. Machines have been around a long time if you count service accounts. But one thing that we know for sure is that the threat landscape is evolving quickly, and it's hard for our customers to keep up. And so we have got to continuously be looking at not just risk at administrative time, but how it is evolving in our customer environments and how those threats are evolving. And so one of the things that we hear from our customers is it's not just about admin time and setting up policy and making sure that we understand risk then and provisioning access, if you will, but really looking at things at the time of session and even when people are at the time of login, but also when people are in session. So understanding and evaluating risk continuously is a big theme from our customer base. And look, SailPoint historically has been in the business of admin time controls, but what we are realizing is that we have to keep evolving with our customers and really look at things continuously, as we've been saying.
Yeah, I love it. We can talk a little bit more about this challenge with speed and maybe the elephant in the room that you pointed out when we saw each other last at SailPoint Navigate in the US, at least. You cited a stat there, I believe, that 75% of breaches start with identity attacks, yet most of our IAM processes require really a human in the loop run on schedules. Maybe you can walk us through a little more about what's been broken about how we manage that access historically, and maybe even some people today.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that happens so often is we provision and forget, is what I like to say, is we establish a control and then we provision access and we forget about it. And, if you think about, I quoted the statistic of 75 breaches start with identity. Bottom line, your attackers are coming in with a valid identity. And so we have provisioned access and it's just sitting out there, and someone comes in with a valid identity, they just inherit that access. So if somebody comes in as Dustin, whatever you have provisioned for you, they're going to automatically inherit, and we won't even notice, right? Because it looks like a valid identity. So it's taking too long to identify that there is an attack in the environment, and two, respond to it, right? So how do we get to a place where we can more actively detect that something is off? And I really I think authentication is sort of an interesting notion in this evolving world, because users are authenticating, bad actors are authenticating. So how do we get to a model where we actually recognize them? So I think recognition becomes really important. And then going back to the controls, like what controls do we put in place when we recognize something might be off? And sometimes we don't have 100% assurity. So those controls evolve, and they may be that we just add some mitigating controls, or maybe it is that we totally kick them out. But we're getting a lot smarter about how do we really start to evaluate the conditions in the environment and respond accordingly. So.
Yeah, it's great. I think we've heard a more common phrase around the identity and security industry that these hackers or bad actors aren't breaking in, they're logging in, which is I think what you're talking about in terms of it's a valid identity.
I think our friends at CrowdStrike, use that quite a bit, and the industry's just kind of taken it over, because I think that's really true, is they're logging in. So we've got to figure out a different way of detecting them.
When you talk to customers or prospects, or not just us on the vendor side, the identity teams, is there a moment when they typically realize that their current approach has a fundamental problem around speed or around responsiveness, or is it usually after an incident occurs? Are teams getting ahead of this? What are you seeing out there from the other side of the coin?
Yeah. Yes to all of the above, honestly. I mean, I think different people at different times, but I mean, obviously, if somebody has had an incident, this is fresh, and they recognize that they've got to do something different. But I feel that customers are definitely feeling the weight of this. So it's not necessarily that they've had an incident, but the reality is they're having trouble scaling. And look, I think I'll talk about agents a little bit, or AI in general. I think our customers are feeling the weight of that, of saying, look, I've had a hard time responding at speed or scaling just in the human identity world. How am I going to do this in a world where we've got machines and agents? Because everything's happening faster and it's happening at a greater volume. So how do I scale? So I think that is really where the conversation is sitting right now, is customers are saying, I got to figure out how to scale and how to respond at the appropriate speed, given the volume and the complexity of agent identities. So I think that's been something that's really kind of gained attention from our customers. And I also think, there's a lot of buzz out there right now around attacks. And again, I'll bring in the use of AI with attacks and the sophistication of the attacks that are happening. I think people are just pausing and taking note and saying, I've got to do something different. What is that going to be? it can't keep doing the same thing and expecting different results type thing. So that tends to be where a lot of our customers have piqued interest in what we're doing around privilege, security, posture management.
Well, and another item that comes up is these customers are not so keen to want to then rip out all the existing systems and the investments that they've made. And you've emphasized that it's not about ripping out existing systems. And this is an idea that's come up with other guests here on our CI sessions. So why is it such an important starting point for this conversation that it's not about ripping out existing systems, but potentially building on top of them?
Yeah. So, I think it's interesting because I definitely don't think this is a rip and replace. This isn't that, hey, the infrastructure and the work you've put in place goes away. So I think a lot of that starts with policy. And the reality is that we're trying to automate more and more and bring in additive, augmenting our existing controls, if you will. So you got to start with the foundation, understanding your entitlements that you have in your environment, putting policy and structure around those high risk entitlements specifically, and then augmenting that with what is currently happening in the environment. So what's missing in our foundation today doesn't go away. You still need that foundation. You still need to provision access. Maybe you just provision just in time, but you still have to do that. But what is missing and what we have to augment with is what is happening right now. So we're still, I like to look at it like we're going to answer the question, who needs access to what? We've been trying to and continue to answer that question. Who needs access to what? Or who can have access to what? But then we're augmenting it with the question of, can they have it right now? And this is where some of those signals or those data points will come in, whether that's a ticket that we kind of talked about at Navigate, or is it, what is their device health right now? Or what is the location, time of day? What are those additional conditions that now augment that fundamental question of who can have access to what with the question, can they have it right now? And I think that's really exciting because it is an augmentation of the controls you have in place, which allows us to really reduce risk at the point of access. And that's exciting.
Yeah, you showed two really compelling use cases in your presentation with Ian Glazer and Matt Hamlin, both previous guests on this program at Navigate in October. I think you talked a little bit about just-in-time provisioning, just-in-time deprovisioning based on these changes in context. And I know that SailPoint, one of your colleagues, Mike Kaiser, is involved in standards and shared signals and these context changes that affect different access requirements or validation, I guess, justification to be able to access information at that time, whether it be ServiceNow tickets or CAPE events or whatever. But for those who weren't in the session, maybe you can walk us through like what that would look like. What's actually happening? A ServiceNow change request triggers something that then gets provisioned through SailPoint?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different use cases, Dustin, and we did at Navigate announce support for the shared signaling framework, which we're really excited about, and this ability to get in real time events from different systems. I think one of the key things that is happening today is we're really looking at an ecosystem of players to help customers reduce risk. So it's not just SailPoint's going to solve all the problems. I mean, you've heard the term identity fabric, and that is really involves an ecosystem of people working together to get information. So in the case of, say, ServiceNow, it may be that they get a ticket that triggers some type of event inside of SailPoint to provision or deprovision. Or it may be that the customer is saying, hey, I want to make sure that before someone logs into a system, that they have a ticket associated with it. So in that case, maybe we partner with somebody like Signal to say, all right, we are going to provision access, but before they can actually utilize that access, we need to make sure that they have an active ticket. And maybe Signal uses their graph database to coordinate that and ensure, okay, they're logging in right now, they have access that's been provisioned to a certain entitlement, and I'm going to make sure now that they actually have a ticket associated with them at the time of login. That's a really powerful use case, because now we're saying we've answered that question. Can they have the access? Yes. But can they, and it's been provisioned in the system, but can they have it right now? And the question then in that case, that scenario would require that they have a ticket associated with the record they're trying to access. That's super powerful, because if you had a hacker that has a valid identity, maybe they're authenticating in, you have that additional layer of control that says they also have to have a ticket associated with this, let's say, privileged transaction. Maybe it's a developer who is going to develop something, or even a customer service rep who is accessing a customer record in a cloud environment. And they have to have a ticket associated with them in order to do that. I think that's where that right now question comes in. And so it's super powerful. And in that scenario, it's ServiceNow and Signal and SailPoint working together as an ecosystem, coming together to satisfy that requirement. And I think that's really powerful.
Yeah, I love this ecosystem approach, especially when you talk about the deprovisioning side too. If I think you mentioned it, if a device gets compromised, there's detected from a mobile device management solution to say something is detected wrong, and then SailPoint can even deprovision that access as well, right? How fast could that actually happen, where it goes from hey, something's wrong with this device to all privilege access is revoked?
Yeah, I mean, I would say in real time or near real time, because again, I mentioned our support for the shared signaling framework. And once we get that event, we can trigger a workflow immediately, depending on when your controls are set up to be cycling to get those events and process them. And really, the reality is our customers are saying we want this in near real time or real time processing of risk and mitigating controls. So we can trigger any type of workflow. So maybe you want to deprovision, but I'll be honest with you, some organizations are nervous about that. They're nervous about deprovisioning events. So what are those mitigating controls? Maybe you trigger an access certification or access review, if you will, and get an instant approval. Or maybe it is you reduce access instead of just cutting it off. But in some cases, maybe you do want to cut it off, so you trigger a deprovisioning. I think the world is your oyster, as they say, when you look at what are the types of things that we can do to mitigate the risk inside of the environment by triggering these different types of workflows. And I'll go back and say this gets into one, the speed, but also the ecosystem we talked about is you've got SailPoint doing one thing, maybe, you have an MDM vendor doing something else, or EDM vendor, and really working together to mitigate the risk, I think, is what is so powerful in those scenarios.
Yeah, it's also nice, like you said, it's not a one size fits all. If you want to mitigate that privilege instead of revoke it entirely or deprovision, like those are all sort of dials that you can turn.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
One thing that struck me in the presentation was, and you mentioned it, was starting with privilege entitlements, or that was an opportunity to focus on privilege. Like we said, it's not one size fits all. Is that something that's coming from customers, that they're really looking to controlling those privileged access entitlements rather than just making everything dynamic right away? Is it an approach to be able to sort of bite off a piece that you can chew as opposed to too much? Why start there, or is it just a starting small type of an approach?
I I think there's a couple things. I think starting small is one of them. Look, the reality is what we're talking about here. It can potentially be a large undertaking. In a utopian world, we would all want to make sure that we have zero standing privilege and that we are answering this question of can they have it right now for every transaction. But we don't live in a utopian world, unfortunately. And so part of it is starting small. But if you're going to start small, where should you start?
Right.
Entitlements. So I think that it boils down to really understanding risk in your environment. What are your highest risk apps? And what are the highest risk entitlements associated with them? And so I think that's one of the value propositions from a SailPoint perspective is helping our customers really understand where they have highly privileged entitlements and classifying those, so discovery and classification of highly privileged entitlements. And then once you have those entitlements, you can start looking at, all right, let's put some of these continuous evaluation, the continuous checking to make sure that those entitlements are secured in the best way possible. So I think it's a little bit of both, like we said. It's a little bit of starting small and then growing it from there, and then really that focus on risk and ensuring that you are focused on the highest risk entitlements in your environment.
Yeah, I mean,
a little bit of both.
Yeah, it makes sense. Shades of gray, right? Everything's not just black and white. So it makes sense to start small and where it makes the most sense for your organization. I think from a practicality perspective, I'll throw some starting points out at you that I've heard. I think from either in the session or from your posting in the past of there's an opportunity to better understand entitlements with LLMs and have AI help. Leaning into this just-in-time access and provisioning with some triggers. We've talked about that a little bit. Obviously infusing context and also starting with some safety nets, some policies, some preventative controls. I'd love to kind of take your lead and unpack some of those or all of those in terms of places to start. I guess you talked a little bit about understanding entitlements. Have you seen AI help when it comes to understanding entitlement catalogs as well?
Yeah, I definitely for at SailPoint, we are looking at using AI on the discovery side. Is where do you have those privileged entitlements? Here's the reality, Dustin. If you look inside of an organization, most organizations have, I would venture to say, even a medium-sized organization has millions of entitlements. If the average organization or the large organization has, let's say, 4,000 apps, and each app has hundreds of entitlements, you can see like we get into the millions. And now you add agents on top of it, and this combination of identities and apps and entitlements, there's so many different things to manage. And we're getting to a point that it's beyond human capacity to understand where we have privilege inside of our environment. So we have to bring in AI to help with that. I think the flip side of AI is AI itself and agents themselves and the LLM infrastructure, if you will, become another source of privilege, right? That has to be secured. So one of the things that we're seeing is the use cases around just in time and continuous. Lots of companies are saying this introduction of agents into our environment, it becomes a focal point and a place we want to start because of the privilege and the access to private or sensitive data that those agents and LLMs have. So it's been kind of interesting. It's a double-edged sword because you want to use AI, but you have to fight fire with fire, as they say. So you're using AI, but you also have to secure AI. So
yeah, And you mentioned it, and you distinguish between just-in-time, I think, access and just-in-time provisioning, right? With triggers that
Yeah.
that sort of kick those off. Could you just sort of shine a light on that a little further, and why it matters? I mean, that's clearly a distinction
Yeah.
there that's important. Yeah.
Yeah. And we kind of joke, even internally at SailPoint, we abuse these terms so badly because everybody's using them to describe different things. So I'm going to give you my version of it. But I think that there is ultimately a goal of zero standing privilege where we don't want to have entitlements sitting out in applications, waiting to be invoked and attacked by a bad actor, right? Like we especially privileged entitlements, we don't want them sitting in the application. And so that is a worthwhile goal of zero standing privilege. So I think zero standing privilege is the goal. How we get there really depends on the support by the app. Some applications require that in order to use it, you have to provision that entitlement or that account and entitlements into the application. And they have their reasons for doing that, right? They might put preferences around the user and the entitlements and accounts or things like that, or it might be for caching purposes, etc. So depending on the app, some applications require you to provision into that entitlement into the application. So how do we go about trying to reduce the amount of the time that entitlement is sitting there? That might be a just-in-time provisioning transaction where we time bound the access in some way, and we do that through what we call activate or deactivate. So this is something that we announced we will be supporting. It hasn't quite been released yet, but we will be supporting this notion of just-in-time provisioning, activation, deactivation. Certainly time bound where you provision for a certain amount of time is something that we already support. But the idea is that it can be a double-edged sword, because if you don't want somebody to have to request access constantly. The noise that would generate for your approvers is too high.
Right.
So with activate, deactivate is you would be allowed to have the access, and that's a longer term action or policy, but you're activating and deactivating so that it's only provisioning for a shorter period of time in the application itself. This is what I would call just-in-time provisioning. Just-in-time access is one where it's more of an authentication model where you're not provisioning and having the access sit inside of the application, but rather it's more of an authentication and authorization flow that is made, and the app supports that and allows you in by externalizing that. So depending on support from an application, that would be something like an IDP might support, or potentially like this runtime authorization function that SailPoint pre-announced support for as well. So super exciting stuff. Yeah, but they're both valid. I think our friend Ian Glazier talks about this of like, both of them are fulfillment, right? Where you're figuring out how the last mile a user is going to get access to a specific application, whether that is at runtime through an authorization call, or if it's actually provisioning, is where you get the difference between the JIT-P and the JIT-A. And hopefully I explained that okay, but yes, they're highly used, highly debated terms.
Well, it's fun. I was going to say it's fun. This is why it's fun to speak to product leaders, because you get the sneak peek of things that have been announced and where they are and not yet released, and you get the real exciting stuff, right? It makes a ton of sense, and you're right. They are nuanced, right? And so some folks can get confused, and it takes a little bit more detailed explanation, which I appreciate. I guess that kind of leads to my next point, which is context matters, right? Like you need a little more context around these pieces, but we also look at context in terms of data around identity processes in IAM. And let me ask what I think is almost an impossible question, but I'll ask it anyway, which is if a team could only add one source of contextual data to their identity or IAM processes, is there one you would recommend?
I don't know. I mean, that's like picking my favorite child, but gosh, I think device health is really important, and I think it's where a lot of customers start. So maybe not even just device health, but like simple, like, is this a corporate owned device? Is a really important question. And so that one comes to mind. I think for certain use cases, does a ticket exist that's assigned to them is also potentially really powerful, because it gets into some of what I'll call production or developer use cases that are such highly critical use cases where you have really, really highly privileged access. It typically has a ticket associated with it. So the ability to say, this person cannot do this unless that's associated or assigned to them is also really powerful. So I'm picking two, but those are probably my two. The device, company owned and health, and then the ticket are kind of my two, what I hear the most about from customers, quite frankly. I don't know if they're my favorite, but that's what I hear the most about.
Yeah, no wrong answers. I appreciate it. Like I said, kind of a
no wrong answer.
Possible question there. The other thing I wanted to ask you about that I mentioned in terms of practical starting points is sort of the proactive versus reactive control. Do you start with a continuous monitoring that catches problems versus trying to prevent everything up front? Are you seeing both approaches, or why one might be selected over another in terms of a safety net versus a preventative control?
Yeah. I see both is what I would say. I think that if you step back and you think about controls, there's really two primary things that happen inside of a customer environment. There's security and risk mitigation, right? There's also compliance. And so in those scenarios, like the security and risk-minded organization might be like, oh, let's get some of those detective controls in place, and or in somewhat, I'm going to say preventative, like maybe continuous, you can think of as a little bit of both. But a compliance-minded organization might be like, oh, I've got to get all my proactive preventative controls in place. I think the reality is you need both. And I think that what most organizations are doing is really focused on high risk and putting both preventative and these continuous controls in place for those high risk areas. Because I think you really need both in order to secure the environment. So it's a tough question to answer. I don't know if there's a right answer, right? I think it really is circumstantial, but I think they work in concert together to help protect the environment. So obviously organizations want to prevent as much as they can, but you can't stop there. And if you only have detective controls, you're going to have too much noise. So it's like, it's one of those things they really need to go hand in hand. Yeah.
It's balance. How are you seeing, yes. I mean, we're talking about a lot of, advanced modern approaches here. And so I'm curious, when you see this architecture, this operationally, how are teams running it? More specifically, are we talking about, identity engineers or identity practitioners that are writing event rules and triggers and managing policy? Or security operations, or are you seeing some new or more hybrid roles that are coming about because of this, and also the LLM and AI components of it?
Yeah, I definitely see hybrid evolving. I think there's a delegated model that is coming out, but I'll talk a little bit about identity and security because I think let's start there. I think
Sure.
it's such an important development in the market where if you go back and look at identity historically, it often has been run in as an operational thing or an enablement thing. So you would see it oftentimes in IT, if you will. And it really was viewed as an enablement and operations, especially in the world that I live in so often of you get the provisioning and deprovisioning of access. You have so many will say, hey, I'm hiring somebody, they need access. This is an enablement function, which it is, but it also is a security function. And one of the things that is happening now as identity has become the control in so many cases, and certainly as we see with machines and agents, that will be more and more true, is that as the control, it starts to bleed into the world of security. And that being said, I also think like your security operations centers, your SOCs, don't have identity context because there has been that divide. So more and more, we're starting to see that with identity as the control and this need to understand identity from the SOC perspective, that the identity and security worlds are merging together. And so I do think that is a kind of better together type approach that we're seeing, and more identity teams are sitting underneath the security organization. But look, the reality is that the identity team doesn't own policy. They don't own who has access to what. That is really a business function, right? That is, maybe you have input around it from your compliance or legal team that says, let's say unless they're a full-time employee, they can't have access to this entitlement or this system. That might be a compliance team having an opinion about it. But really, at the end of the day, the line of business, your app owners and your line of business owners are the ones who really own policy. So where I was going with this is that it's got to be people working together to put the proper controls in place, and then you can add in the systems and applications for detective controls, continuous monitoring. So I really see identity and security teams as providing the tools necessary to implement these controls. But at the end of the day, the business has to get involved and be engaged. So this delegated and distributed model, I think, becomes really important in implementing these systems.
Yeah. More things change. And I want to put it.
Yeah.
I want to give you the opportunity to also expand upon the SailPoint value there that you're leading from a product perspective. So we don't have to get specific in terms of features and functions, but curious what you can share, what types of things you're building that SailPoint is helping to make this type of workflow and orchestration easier for teams that are hybrid, that are engaging between IT, identity, security, and the business.
Yeah. So one of the big themes, or the big theme for us at Navigate, which was just a month ago,
Seems like
I guess it's almost 2 months now, dang it. Yeah. But is this notion of adaptive identity. And that's not like a product announcement. It's really more about a movement, if you will, of moving to a model where identity is much more adaptive. So certainly in our core feature set, adding some support for delegation of what we just talked about. But a few things that we actually announced at Navigate that are important. I already mentioned the shared signaling framework, support for the shared signaling framework. Then we looked at privilege, security, posture management, and this really is about identifying, discovering your privileged entitlements, and then putting some just-in-time controls around that. We also released our identity graph, which is so important in understanding relationships across the environment, and then our response and remediation, which is an integration between the identity teams and the SOC. So in building out integrations with our partners in, say, the SOAR world, but also having an agent ourselves that will help the SOC team answer the question, like, give me the identity context. Who is this identity? What else do they have access to? When was the last time they accessed it, et cetera? So bringing the security and identity teams closer together. And then just all kinds of support around agents and managing and governing agents as well. So a lot of really exciting things. I'm sure I'm missing some, but moving to this model that takes into account, particularly again in the world of AI and agents and machines, that we have to be much more adaptive and we have to be able to respond, not just at admin time, but at runtime and while they're in session with different controls, so that we can keep up with the speed of innovation that's happening outside of identity and security, but in the business app world and with AI and ML. So,
yeah, wow, got your work cut out for you. So, like you said, it's a lot. And
I'm sure there's a lot going on, and it's super exciting. But yeah, there's a lot going on.
And as we start to sort of wrap up here with Lori Robinson from SailPoint, if I ask you to kind of look forward, what do you see is still missing? Where are some gaps that you're seeing in this approach that's it's not quite working at scale across these diverse enterprise environments? We talked a lot about ecosystem, about augmentation versus replacement, a lot of these hybrid things. Is there anything that stands out to you as we're missing this piece of connection, or that you see being solved in the future?
Yeah, I'm not going to say it's missing. I think we just have to continue to evolve. But I think that there's what we would call next generation governance, and this ability to really understand the environment better. And to do that, it's really going to require AI. So baselining with policy and automation, but over time, it kind of bleeds into what I had said about recognition versus authentication. Mm-hmm. I do believe that we are going to a model where the things we've talked about today are enhanced by AI and learning over time to really get to a place of recognition where we start to recognize who users are and when something inappropriate is happening in our environment and respond to it. I think authentication and even sometimes controls aren't enough. We've got to be able to recognize when something's off. And the only way to do that, in my opinion, is with AI. So I think we're laying the foundation that allow us to baseline and build that over time.
Wow, that's great. Okay, so some takeaways, Lori, for teams or somebody is watching this session and they wanted to start small, prove some value, or maybe they could only implement one thing next week. What would the use case or the item that you would recommend that they focus on to tackle first?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of a two-part thing, but really understanding risk. I think this is obvious, is identify your high-risk entitlements. And that's where you focus. Because those are, if you will, your crown jewels. It's what the threat actors are after. And the second part of that is identify high value signals. So I mentioned two that I think are high value, but every organization is different. I mean, it might be that your retail and time of day is actually the most important thing because nothing happens after 9 o'clock or whatever it is, whatever your high risk entitlements, whatever the most valuable signal you can put around that. So focus on risk and value, and narrow it down to one scenario, right? Like we talked about, start small, but make it worth it. Make it have big impact. Like maybe it's a small surface, but has a big impact in securing that environment.
Yeah, great advice. So Lori, where will you be next? Where can people, listeners, audience maybe see you in real life and in 3D? Are there events, maybe Gartner, that you'll be attending or anything in the rest of the year here?
Yeah, so I'll be at the upcoming Gartner events, namely in Grapevine, coming up in December, and then, potentially in London. So we'll see about that. But yeah, that's the next big one. And hopefully taking a break over the holidays. So we'll see.
Yeah, hopefully. I think there was a Navigate tour that you were on too. So I'm sure that the good flyer mileage are piling up. Well, we always like to end on a question for each person on the show, and in the spirit of just continually evolving, I'm just curious, something that you continuously do. Maybe there's something that you just can, incessantly work at, or you don't give up trying, or you're just, always focused on getting better. Anything come to mind professionally or otherwise?
Oh yeah. I'll answer otherwise. I'll answer personally. So I love gardening. So my garden is constantly evolving, is what I would say. Like every year is a new journey to add to it and make it better. So I'll answer on the personal side. That's a little
Although I imagine in Utah, if the snow does start falling, then your garden is affected.
Yeah. No, this is a spring and fall thing. Yes, it's winter gets a rest for sure.
Yeah. Well, let's give you a rest then, Lori. Thank you so much for joining us. Thanks to everyone who joined us and engaged. And if there are follow-up questions, please send them over, because just a reminder, all of these sessions, the Signal Continuous Identity sessions, are recorded and available at signal.ai and on our YouTube channel. We're racking up a pretty big on-demand library at the CI sessions, and you can subscribe at signal.ai to get details on all upcoming episodes. You'll find resource links and any articles that Lori and I mentioned, or maybe the Navigate session that we can link to in the follow-up email if you're a subscriber. Next time, same channels, next level insights. The next continuous identity session is coming soon. Until then, keep making identity work better and more continuous. Thank you, Lori. Thank you, listeners. And we'll see you next time. Take care.
Thank you.